On January the 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and his followers announced to their countrymen and to the rest of the world that their home was no longer the French colony of San Domingue. It was now the nation of Haiti. After years of revolutionary civil war, the abolition of slavery, and fears of slavery's return, Dessalines asked the citizens of Haiti to let us swear to fight to our last breath for the independence of our country. That nation was the world's first black republic. Dessalines was at the center of Haiti's revolutionary storms, but he has often been overshadowed by revolutionaries like Toussaint Louverture, and his memory has been shaped by French reactionaries. But what can we learn from a man born enslaved on a San Domingue coffee plantation who died emperor of Haiti, a man who boasted, "I have avenged America"? Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, and welcome to Revolutions in Retrospect, a podcast from Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media that explores the histories of the revolutions that remade the Atlantic world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Julia Gaffield, Associate Professor of History at the College of William and Mary, who joins me to discuss her new book, I Have Avenged America, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Haiti's Fight for Freedom. I am delighted to have you here today. As I understand it, this is the first opportunity you've had to talk about your magnificent book, and so I'm honored to have you talking about a book that has one of the best titles I think I've seen. I Have Avenged America, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Haiti's Fight for Freedom. We know something about the Haitian Revolution. We learned that in school. The creation of the first Black Republic, the abolition of slavery, on what is the former French colony of San Domingue. We know some of the major figures, but Dessalines, I think, has escaped our view in a lot of ways, at least to the general public. So let's start with him. Who was Jean-Jacques Dessalines?
Dessalines was, of course, one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. He was the man who declared Haitian independence from France in 1804. He became the country's first head of state, first as governor general, then as emperor. And as you said, more and more people are learning about the Haitian Revolution in school, if they're lucky. Not everybody has the opportunity, but they often learn about Toussaint Louverture. And Dessalines is kind of one of several very key leaders of the Haitian Revolution.
So let's start with his early life. What is the world in which he is born into on San Domingue?
So he is born in Saint Domingue sometime around 1758. And the year that he was born, there's kind of no concrete evidence about that, but it's one of a few things that most people agree on is the year that he was born, even though we don't have the documentation that people would really want to say that, certainly. So he grew up in San Domingue, which was France's most wealth-producing colony. And I say wealth-producing because a lot of people often say richest. And I'm like, well, some people were rich. And he was enslaved from the time that he was born. He grew up on two different coffee plantations. I was going to say sugar because that's the main crop of the colony. But he was enslaved on two different coffee plantations in a parish called Grande Rivière du Nord, which is in the northern part of the colony. And it's in a mountainous region that is just south of the kind of main sugar plains in the north, surrounding the city of Cap Français, the kind of big commercial center in the north. He was enslaved by three, probably four different people, one white man, two free black men, and one free black woman. Probably the kind of legality of her ownership is kind of unclear. But he kind of labored on smaller coffee plantations until the start of the Haitian Revolution in 1791.
I'd like to explore for a moment the kind of demography of the colony. When I was reading your book, I was thinking a lot about Jamaica in this period, Britain's wealthiest colony, where it's predominantly enslaved people who are part of the population. There is a small white population, but there's also this emerging free people of color and mixed race population. Is there something similar that's happening in San Domingue as well. And because it struck me as really fascinating that, as you said, Dessalines is owned by a white person, but then it seems as though he's also owned by free people of color as well. And those demographics were really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the makeup of the island and how we get to this really complex population?
Yeah, it is a complex population. The population is absolutely majority people who are enslaved, who would be considered either black or at the time nègre. The majority of those people would have been born in Africa, but several hundred thousand were also kind of born in the colony, Creoles like Dessalines. And then the colony is home to a kind of equal number of free white people and free people of color, somewhere just under 30,000 for each. And then there's about, I think, almost 500,000 enslaved people, right? So a drastically different population count for those different demographics. The people who were known as free people of color might have been of mixed race, but they also might have been, at the time, people who would have been called black or nègre. And so within the population of free people of color, it's also a kind of racially, socially, economically stratified group. The region where Dessalines grew up, in Grande-Rivière du Nord, there was a higher number of free people of color who would have been called black, noir, or nègre at the time. So it's a higher percentage of a free black population rather than necessarily free people of mixed race. And so the people who enslaved him, 2 or 3, depending on the legality of it, they were free black men and a free black woman. And so, I think that in some ways this might kind of change the social dynamics within the plantations. The first person who enslaved him, a poor white man named Duclos, we don't know the first name, but Duclos, was said to be a kind of notoriously cruel person, kind of violently punished and reprimanded Dessalines. And I suspect that the kind of dynamics of enslavement changed as he, I guess, transferred ownership, and he was enslaved on a coffee plantation where he was also enslaved with an extended family. And so I imagine, although the kind of evidence for this time in his life is very thin, I imagine that those social dynamics within the plantation would have been dramatically different.
What sources are we using to reconstruct that life? As you said, it's questionable whether or not he was actually born in 1758, but the evidence seems to suggest, at least what we have, that that's the case. How do you go about figuring out what his early world looked like?
It wasn't easy. And there's limits to what you can say, right? So a lot of what you can say has to do with kind of broader trends, things that scholars have kind of noticed over time about the more general context and population. Some of the information comes from early accounts, early 19th century accounts that describe his early life. There's Haitian historians Thomas Madieu and Beaubrun-Ardouin who have included references to his early life. There's a really important French consul who writes in, I think, 1825, maybe the 1820s. Not good with dates, surprising for a historian, but who kind of references early parts of his life. And so some of sources like that that are kind of reflecting back on his years during slavery. But then there's one archival document that mentions him by name. And this is a document that was first identified by French historian Jacques Dessalines, and it is a lease for the plantation where he was enslaved. This is the second plantation in the Cormier Valley, and he was enslaved by a man named Philippe Jasmin, sometimes with the name Désir attached. And he leases the plantation to his father-in-law, which we will I'm sure, get to, but his father-in-law, or Philippe Jasmin's father-in-law, is the man who later takes the name Toussaint Louverture. And in this document, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who is not yet going by the name Dessalines, is mentioned just as Jean-Jacques. He is assigned a value, as are all of the other people, the 13 people listed in this lease. So Philippe Jasmin is leasing the plantation to Toussaint de Breda, who later became Toussaint Louverture, and they're listing the property. And so in this document, you get a description of who is enslaved on the plantation, but you also get a description of all the buildings that are on the plantation, how the land is divided. And so it's this kind of, even though it's a one-off document, it really does give you a better sense of the surroundings, where he lived, the kind of buildings that were there, how the garden plots, how many people were kind of sleeping in how many buildings. So even though it's a very slim record, we're able to learn a fair amount about what life was like for Dessalines during slavery.
It's amazing that you can pull out that much from a single document, but that kind of miraculously, a single document like that survives and then allows you to rebuild this whole sort of local world within this bigger story.
Right. And the people who are listed, the enslaved people who are listed in the document, are described as being people of the same family. And so on the list, it starts with somebody who is Dessalines, or Jean, and in the document he's Jean-Jacques, but his uncle named Etienne. And then everybody else on the list is described in relation to Etienne. So they're either sisters or nephews or nieces. And so we learn that Dessalines was enslaved with an uncle and aunts and some cousins of various ages. So some of them are younger, and you can determine that based on their valuation.
They're living in a world, as you said, in enslavement on an island as part of a French colony. And earlier you had gestured towards both coffee and sugar and wealth. Can you tell us a little bit about the colony of San Domingue as a wealth engine for France in the 18th century?
I mean, the entire point of the colony was to produce wealth for export. And this came in the form of primarily sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton, and then there's kind of sub industries, so there's molasses and that type of thing. But the bulk of what was produced in the colony was sugar, and then coffee as a secondary. And coffee, right, the kind of the topography of the island was suitable for both. There's these kind of higher elevated plains, flat land outside some of the port cities that was kind of ideal for sugar cultivation. And then the mountainous regions, mainly to the interior, were ideal for coffee production. But this is not a place where people kind of want to migrate and kind of keep the wealth there, right? It's an extractive endeavor.
What was it like to labor on a coffee plantation?
So some of the kind of description of what it was like to labor on the coffee plantation is always in comparison to laboring on a sugar plantation.
Sure.
And the labor on a sugar plantation was much more cyclical, and there were very intensive times of year. Harvesting was a very intense time to be working, very dangerous time to be working also. Coffee production and cultivation was much more consistent throughout the year. And there's two different harvesting periods, but it's less time constrained. On sugar plantations, you have the problem of spoilage, whereas that's not the case. There isn't kind of the urgency during harvesting on a coffee plantation. Sugar plantations were a lot bigger. They required a kind of investment in terms of like irrigation and mills that coffee plantations did not require. And so you get a lot of smaller plots of land. Instead of being enslaved with 100 to 200 people, people on coffee plantations were enslaved with a much smaller group. The labor was much equal is not exactly the right word, but like the tasks were kind of much more similar and everybody did more similar labor, I guess. Certainly there were different tasks reserved for stronger people or people with much more specialized knowledge in pruning the trees and stuff like that. But the labor was a little more equally distributed, I guess. And then often the people who owned the plantations would labor alongside the people who they enslaved. And that's not to say that there wasn't the same kind of context or the same possibility of violence and kind of emotional and physical trauma. For example, the first person who enslaved Dessalines Duclos, this poor white person, was notoriously violent, and Dessalines kind of very famously carried scars from his time enslaved on that plantation. So there are different contexts and different kinds of labor, but I think it's also kind of telling that after independence, sugar production dramatically decreased, whereas coffee production did not kind of decrease in the same way, right? That it's a different type of work.
Because it's a different type of work, did it have, so I'm assuming then that it has a less deleterious effect on bodies than sugar would have. And so I guess the question I'm driving at is, for coffee planters, did they have to rely on a constant infusion of enslaved people from the transatlantic slave trade, as sugar planters often did, given the nature of that work?
No, I don't. I mean, I can't say overall for sure, but so life expectancy, particularly in the mountainous region, right, the cooler climates, but also laboring in smaller groups with people who don't have the same kind of capital, I think does produce a situation in which life expectancy increases, and it's not the same kind of, oh, it's cheaper to buy a new captive and enslave them on your plantation and kind of work the people to death. I don't have the kind of exact statistics, and I don't know that it's possible in terms of life expectancy and lifespan on coffee plantations versus sugar plantations, although maybe somebody has done that work.
Or a good research topic for somebody.
It's possible. Or maybe it's impossible, but given the data, I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Dessalines strikes me as somebody, and not to sort of put a simple point on it, but someone who is experiencing a typical life of enslavement in the Caribbean up to a point. But then one of the things I loved about your book is it's very propulsive. There is just so much action going on from roughly about 1789 on forward to 1804. Can you tell us a little bit about the outbreak of revolutions in the late 18th century in France in 1789 and how that affects the colonies in San Domingue? It's a very chaotic experience, trying to keep in your head what's happening in one place, how it's affecting the other. Can you help us a little bit sort of unpack how the outbreak of revolutionary fervor in Europe and in the colonies are shaping each place, but more importantly, I think, shaping each other?
Yeah, and I think we can even go back a little bit farther.
Let's do it.
One of the things that I talk about is the fact that the third or fourth, the last person who enslaved Dessalines, whose name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, that's where he gets his last name, fought with the unit of chasseurs volontaires in the Battle of Savannah.
Yes.
And he was a militia leader in San Domingue, and he and several other people from the region went to Savannah in 1779.
Right.
Right. And so, quizzing me on my dates. And I think
there'll be one for the audience later too, so it's okay.
Right. Exactly. Perfect. So I think the context of like the Age of Revolution starts and is personally connected to Dessalines earlier than 1789 or 1791, right? I speculate in the book as to whether Dessalines had any experience in the colonial militia with Jean-Jacques Dessalines. There's little evidence to suggest it or to kind of to be able to prove that. But it was one of the only ways that enslaved people could be manumitted, could secure their freedom in a tax-free transaction, I guess. And it's possible, right? So enslaved people sometimes served in the colonial militia. So I wonder in the book as to whether this was perhaps where he got some of his military experience. The book is very, I was very intentional in writing it about making it a local story. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of it happens in Grande Rivière du Nord, in Saint-Marc, around Cap Français, later just called Cap. And I'm kind of really zoomed in on Dessalines' life, what he's experiencing. And so the kind of, the 1789 moment that I think is really important for him is an uprising of free people of color in Grande Rivière du Nord, right? In his home parish. They are agitating for equal rights as, free subjects in the colony, 2 miles from the plantation where he is enslaved. And this is initially led by Jean-Baptiste Chauvin. And then Vincent Auger joins him, who had been advocating in France. But I think he's kind of exposed to this advocacy in 1789 and then continues for the next couple years. And they eventually use the Declaration of the Rights of Man to say, listen, you're saying all men are created equal. Yes, we are free people and we want to be equal too, but they're not advocating for the rights of enslaved people or the abolition of slavery. And so I think there's a very local and direct connection with the French Revolution, but it kind of manifests in a very different way, right? This is not how that document was intended. And so I kind of look at how things get translated in the colony.
Well, it's a good example of how revolutions are very personal, and they're not simply writing a Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia or a Declaration of Rights of Man in Paris or wherever. It's these things are happening in communities and real people's lives. And as all of this is breaking out, you mentioned it earlier, but there's a man who is commonly known about as part of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, who looms very large in this book, looms very large in the history of the Haitian Revolution, but also, as you suggested earlier, has a very, very personal connection to Dessalines. Can you tell us a little bit about their relationship and how that is transformed by these moments?
Yeah, and so the Toussaint Louverture looms large in histories of the Haitian Revolution, as I think he should, right? But one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was that I noticed people kept writing biographies of Toussaint Louverture, and this is especially kind of people outside of Haiti. Were super interested in Louverture, and these textbooks that you get this often little snippets about the revolution in high school or whatever, they focus on Louverture. And that's great. People should write biographies of Toussaint Louverture. But I think there's other people who deserve biographies, one of them being Dessalines.
Dessalines, yeah.
And they also have, I think, a really interesting and complicated relationship. And I think it's in some ways a friendship, but it's also a relationship that is kind of founded on respect and a commitment to the same shared values, right? They meet in the 1770s while Dessalines is enslaved. It's in 1779. And this is when the plantation is leased. And so after that lease lasts for 2.5 years, right? It starts 6 months or 6 months before the lease and then continues for 2 years. This sun is driving me crazy.
No, it's just the light of knowledge shining upon you.
We didn't plan for this. How can I get away from it? So they meet during they might have met before the lease.
Sure.
It's hard to tell, and it's hard to tell when Dessalines kind of was sold from his first enslaver to his second. Anyway, so they might have met before 1779, but for 2.5 years, Louverture is leasing this plantation and the labor of the people who were enslaved there. And so he's got authority over Dessalines. He can kind of give him orders, and Dessalines is supposed to obey them. And in some ways, that dynamic, even though it's very different, right? Mm-hmm. Dessalines is always Louverture's subordinate. He, sometime in the early revolution, joins Louverture's unit, and so they kind of fight together. And they fight together for most of the revolution. Dessalines rises in the ranks to become one of Louverture's senior officers, but they're always in this hierarchical relationship.
Right.
And I think, I am not convinced that Dessalines would have kind of allowed for that relationship with anyone. I think he genuinely respected Louverture. I did not get the sense that he was somebody who would have followed orders from somebody who he did not respect. And I think the evidence kind of shows that he was willing to be insubordinate if his own judgment kind of contradicted what was being given. But they've got this, I don't know if we're jumping ahead too much, but, the end of their relationship, I think, is quite dramatic. And I think in the end, Dessalines feels betrayed by Louverture in the sense of, I think he felt like he was betraying their shared values.
What would you say that those shared values are as they are waging war against the French, waging war against other colonists, waging war against the British at some point, or in other, polities that are on the island? What is their end goal? What do they want to achieve together?
I mean, the abolition of slavery, but then the preservation of the abolition of slavery, right? Like they're, after 1793, when slavery is abolished in the colony, after 1794, when slavery is abolished in the entire French Empire, there's never the kind of, dead certainty that this is going to last. And so I think even after abolition, there's still the fight for abolition, if that makes sense.
No, perfect sense, yeah.
But then a commitment to equality, right? The kind of elimination of racism and racial hierarchies in the colony. So I think those two things together, and they're both of their deep commitment to abolition and equality, is what keeps them together, right? I think they were brought together in a different capacity, but I think that's what ties them together over the course of the revolution.
Well, as you say, there's this constant pervasive fear that slavery will be reimposed from the mother country, right? And so there's, thinking about how to stave off this, to preserve their freedom, preserve abolition, and make it permanent. But, going back to your earlier comment about the nature of this story, this sort of very local one, very personal one, Civil War breaks out in 1798. How does that happen? I mean, I guess in some ways, right, it's the nature of revolutions. They're so messy. There are so many different factions that like in the United States, you could say in the 1790s with the Whiskey Rebellion, inevitably there will be a revolt of some kind amongst an emerging new power. But take us into the dynamics of this civil conflict.
Yeah, it's a complicated, period during the revolution, right? But I find it such an interesting time in Dessalines' life, right? So the Civil War is essentially a kind of political struggle, power struggle between Toussaint Louverture and André Rigaud, Louverture in the north, Rigaud in the south. Dessalines is fighting alongside Toussaint Louverture. But what how the kind of conflict plays out is that it ends up being a contest over the meaning or the kind of ability to prove one's republicanism.
Right.
So this is in like a kind of deeply Republican phase of the Haitian Revolution, and kind of the way the political struggle kind of plays out is that everybody's claiming to be like the best Republican or the most legitimate Republican.
Yeah.
And what republicanism meant at the time was deeply ambiguous. It was a kind of commitment to abolition, right? And very soon after slavery is abolished, Republicans throughout the French Empire start claiming it as like their own doing, that they did this out of the goodness of their hearts. And this was a Republican achievement, even though they were forced to do this by revolutionaries in San Domingue. So a commitment to abolition, in the colony, it ends up being loyalty, patriotism, right? So loyalty to France is a key part of colonial republicanism. And then anti-monarchy, right? Which very most often manifests itself as like anti-British sentiment, right? So abolition, nationalism or patriotism, and anti-British. This is kind of what made a true Republican in the colony during this battle. And Dessalines gets kind of framed as being like a very good Republican. And republicanism is not really part of his identity or legacy. And so I as I was researching this era, it surprised me how he was held up as this like model Republican. And there's one French representative who was like, the French nation will never forget your republicanism and your contributions. And I mean, the exact quotation is way better. But I'm like, well, everybody quickly forgot that. But it is this kind of ideological conflict that's really just a political conflict that is, in the conflict, the flames of the conflict were stoked by French representatives in the colony who wanted to kind of create some more chaos. This is a guy, Eduville, who was kicked out because everybody hated him. And he was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try and instigate civil war.
Yeah, I love the French in the book because these commissioners will routinely show up or periodically show up, and they'll be coming with certain objectives, and it just sort of blows everything up from there.
Or they're just like unable to do what they set out to do. And they're like, oh, we don't actually get to tell you what's happening. Like we'll do the best we can to do that. But basically like, they have very little authority or not anywhere close to the same authority that they thought they had or wanted to have.
Well, as people are imposing this sort of perfect republicanism on Dessalines, do we know how he saw himself in this moment?
Well, he's fully playing into this, right? And there's, this is a way to kind of gain legitimacy or to kind of maintain legitimacy, to gain power. So he is fashioning himself as this model Republican, and he's getting rewarded for that and getting gifts from the French Republic for his service and those types of things. So I think it's a very strategic, it's a strategic moment where he's kind of, okay, this is what you want to see. Great, I can do that.
As he's doing this and as the Civil War is playing out, we're getting closer to the turn of the 19th century. Certain people are on the rise in France, but more importantly, right, things are still interesting back in Saint-Domingue. What happens, as you referenced earlier, what happens to Louverture, his fall, but also then sort of concurrently, in many interesting ways, Dessalines' rise?
There's after the Civil War, Louverture kind of commissions and institutes a colonial constitution. This is in 1801, and it's a constitution for Saint-Domingue that still claims allegiance to France, still claims that Saint Domingue is a colony. But many at the time took it as a declaration of independence, which Louverture at the time and later insisted it was not. And his explanation was that the new French Constitution had declared that the colonies could have special laws, which, opened the door for the possibility of slavery in the colonies, right? If there's different laws for the colony, then maybe those laws could mean the return of slavery. And so he commissioned and instituted the 1801 Constitution to preserve abolition. This is in the context of pro-slavery voices gaining power in France, gaining kind of roles in government. And so there's a threat. So he publishes the Constitution. Some took it as a declaration of independence. And Napoleon responds by sending a fleet of ships under the direction of his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc. They arrive in 1802, and they're given a kind of set of instructions that they have the goal of initially playing nice with they call them the colonial generals, so Louverture, Dessalines, and others, but that eventually they were going to need to be deported. But in the first phase, they were going to try and use them to gain control of the colony. So it's in this context that Louverture, this is his kind of downfall. The French expedition, they lie to everybody, right? They say, you're safe. We want to play nice. We would never reinstitute slavery. Anybody who tells you otherwise is a total liar. When in fact they are keeping their true motives secret. And so there's fighting for a while, but eventually Louverture and other generals kind of concede and form an alliance with Leclerc. And this is on the condition that he's going to kind of retire from his position as general. And I think this moment, there's a description of a moment between Louverture and then Dessalines and then another leading general, Charles Belair, in which Louverture tells Dessalines and Belair that he has allied with Leclerc. And from Louverture's own description in his memoirs that he writes from prison, this is like a devastating blow for Dessalines and Belair. And I think that this is a moment where, that kind of trust and respect that I had talked about in their relationship, I think that's a moment where that trust and respect is broken. And this is one of those moments where you're writing a book and you're like, I'm a serious historian, but somebody else who had kind of creative liberties could do a really dramatic reenactment of that conversation. And I think there's kind of just enough in the sources to really be able to create a kind of a scene with this conversation, because Louverture describes Dessalines and Belair as kind of crying and like pleading with him to not do this. But I think that conversation, in a sense, is the end of their relationship. And very soon after, Louverture is arrested under kind of false accusations and deported to France, where he ends up kind of dying of neglect in a jail in the Jura Mountains.
Well, after you're done with the book tour for this book, you can turn your very many talents to writing a play about
that is not my domain. That is somebody else would be so good at that.
And it could be the next Hamilton with you can be the next Ron Chernow.
I don't know about
Well, let's go to the Haitian independence. That declaration, January 1st, 1804, Dessalines is a key factor, a key driver of this. This is a momentous moment in world history.
It is. I think it is. I always tell my students that the Haitian Revolution is one of the greatest events in world history. Right. So how we get to independence, this conversation with Louverture and Dessalines, eventually Dessalines kind of concedes and also allies with the French expedition for a brief period. I think it's kind of under false pretenses, and it's not like a genuine alliance, but there's also a kind of practical nature that he's not really in a position to be able to fight this battle. In I think it's September or October. I think it's September that news arrives in San Domingue that slavery has been re-legalized or legalized elsewhere in the French Empire, and so all these fears that slavery was returning. This kind of gives credence to those claims or those fears. And so in October of 1802, there's a kind of coalition of the generals, of the revolutionary generals, and they agree that now is the time to break with France. And it becomes a war for independence only in late 1802, right? Up until then, it hadn't been a war for independence. Within months, or depending on who you ask, a couple months, Dessalines assumes leadership of this kind of unified independence movement. And very quickly, he starts planning for independence, right? In June of 1803, so a few months later, a little over half a year later, he writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying like, hey, we're going to be independent. Can we trade with you? And he writes a similar letter to the governor of Jamaica. The guy George Nugent says, we want to trade with you too. And so he's planning for independence. The war is not yet won in June of 1803, but it's heading in that direction. They kind of secure their final victory in November of 1803. And amazingly, there's kind of two different declarations of independence, one on November 29th, 1803, and the other one on January 1st, 1804. Woo. And the like month between those two declarations is a kind of really critical moment in the history of the Haitian Revolution. The French evacuate in November, right? They lose this final battle. They are forced to evacuate, but they don't concede defeat. And it's not really clear that they don't concede defeat immediately, but in December of 1803, it becomes really clear that they're not, that this war is ongoing, right? A French general, Louis Ferrand, evacuates to the eastern side of the island, what had been the Spanish colony, and was still at the time referred to as the Spanish side, even though the French had legal dominion over it. And he is there kind of waging war with proclamations, with piratical attacks on foreign shipping. And he's also claiming that reinforcements are coming from France and like, we're going to get the colony back. And that becomes very clear in December, right? And so the January 1st, 1804 Declaration of Independence is very much a document produced in the context of ongoing threats to Haiti and a kind of deep fear that their victories were still kind of precarious. So, Dessalines is the kind of primary figure in the Declaration of Independence. It is composed of three different parts. There's the first part is the Act of Independence, l'Acte d'Indépendance. I think it's the act, not the oath, but it's comprised of an oath signed by a bunch of generals. And then there's a kind of bigger middle part that is a speech by Dessalines to the people of Haiti. And then the final part is a nomination by the generals of Dessalines to the position of Governor General for Life of Haiti. And that's the same title that Louverture had held, Governor General for Life, but of the colony of San Domingue.
We've been talking about San Domingue, but now we have the nation of Haiti. Where does the word Haiti come from?
It is a callback to what the island was called by the indigenous people who lived there before and when Columbus arrived on the island. And I think it's a really interesting choice for several reasons. There's an erasure of French colonialism, right? We're not taking that name. Spanish colonialism too, right? Santo Domingo. There's a kind of an erasure of the era of colonialism. But it's a word that meant mountainous. And I think that, in the history of the revolution, the mountains were central. They were central to the revolutionary success. And, they were kind of key places where the revolutionaries preferred to fight in some ways, because this was their battleground. They developed tactics to kind of maximize their success in the mountains. They were places of refuge, but they were also places of refuge in the colonial era, right? People who escaped slavery often found refuge in the mountains. And then in the independence era, they remained kind of central to national defense. And Dessalines instituted, he kind of instructed his military to build forts inland in the mountains, and that they would be kind of ready to destroy the port towns, and they would retreat to the mountains to protect the nation. And there's a really great documentary film about Dessalines. I think it's called Le Vainqueur de Napoléon. And there's beautiful drone footage of all of these inland forts, right? So I think that the mountains had a symbolic role, but then I think there's just the callback to a time before French and Spanish colonialism.
Is there reclaiming an identity, but also constructing a new one? In independent Haiti, Dessalines becomes emperor. Why does he become emperor, and then how does his story end?
This is one of the moments where he doesn't kind of detail these decisions very clearly. So he's given this title, Governor General for life, at the moment of independence. But by October of 1804, he is crowned Emperor Jacques I. Haiti, up until then, right, on January 1st, 1804, Haiti was not a republic. They called it the state of Haiti. And so there was very much, it wasn't a republic that turned into an empire. It was just the state of Haiti first. And I think republicanism had not exactly proven to be an effective ideology for supporting their goals, right? It kind of allowed it allowed the return of slavery within the empire. In the U.S., it was still a slaveholding nation. So as a kind of model for what they were aspiring to, it's not all that convincing. I think there's an alignment between the creation of an empire and the need to kind of to govern Haiti as a nation at war, right? So he's kind of come up through this military hierarchy that is a very strict hierarchy. There's one person at the top. And I think the empire aligns with that structure. Yeah. And I think it aligns with what he saw as the needs of the new nation. I think had France conceded defeat, had they not been forced to be a nation at war, I'm not sure whether they could have gone in a different direction or whether they would have gone in a different direction. But this kind of centralized authority mirrors the military hierarchy. And then, of course, Napoleon becomes emperor that summer as well. And the kind of dates of how this all plays out are inconsistent, but it's likely that the Haitian state and Dessalines' advisors kind of felt that they wanted to be on an equal footing with France in terms of the international stage, just to kind of emphasize that they were no longer a colony, right? That Governor General was a title for somebody who governed a colony, and we need something for an independent nation.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And both of them, in some sense, crowning themselves emperors in this moment, or being crowned emperor. Napoleon's at war with everybody in Europe at this point. And as you say, Dessalines and his comrades are concerned that there will be the reimposition of slavery, that their independence, while declared, is not secured. And so if you have a kind of clear command structure and you remain on a martial footing to mobilize resources, then, perhaps that's the way to go. It doesn't end well for him.
It does not end well. So this, the decision to declare an empire was not universal within the country. There were some who disagreed with this move. And there were some who felt that they had been kind of excluded from the process. And so in 1806, there's a Republican revolution in the South, right? And some of this ties back to the Civil War and these kind of longer standing tensions. And while Dessalines was able to kind of unite these different factions for the war for independence, after 1804 is a different story, and he wasn't able to kind of maintain or sustain that unity. Okay. So he is assassinated in 1806 and by Republican revolutionaries from the South, and it's this kind of brutal ambush. He gets kind of their justification is that he was he kind of took all the power and was kind of governing at his own kind of whims, and that they wanted a kind of more diffuse power structure. So it doesn't end well for him.
Yes, and we'll leave it to readers of the book to learn what becomes of his very physical person, because it's pretty gruesome, but it's also kind of a fascinating insight into how people are thinking about identity and state formation and memorialization. But that kind of gets us to our last question then, which is, how does his life, as you say at the beginning of our conversation, not a lot of people have paid as much attention as they should have to Dessalines. How do you see his life helping us better understand this very tumultuous age?
His memory is complicated. He is often a polarizing figure. In Haiti, he's kind of remembered as the founding father. But his memory is also used in politics, especially in instances where people want to kind of emphasize and assert sovereignty. But then there's also so there's this deep association with independence, but then also association with anti-racism and kind of Black power within Haitian politics. Outside of Haiti, he's usually been kind of demonized, right? And this started during his lifetime, but also continues today. And he gets portrayed and got portrayed as somebody who is kind of uniquely violent, even within this revolutionary context. Right. And then character descriptions often did and do claim that he was illiterate, and as this kind of creation of a barbaric revolutionary, this trope. I think that a lot of these descriptions there was a simultaneous, at the time, there was a simultaneous effort to undermine Haiti as a country, and by attacking Dessalines as a person, it helped that goal. And so a lot of the sources that are available just reproduce these stereotypes. And there's this famous biography that was published by like a mouthpiece for the Napoleonic government by this guy, Louis de Broca. And it's like fiction, right? But it's a biography, and yet it has had this kind of staying power and shaped perceptions of him at the time. It was translated into multiple languages. And so, there was a sense that people could kind of just make up whatever they wanted because they wanted to attack Haiti as a country. He was somebody who kind of met violence with violence, right? But it was a violent revolution all around. And people often kind of focus on the violence that he perpetrated rather than the violence that he was subjected to.
Right.
And so what I wanted to do was kind of offer this fuller picture of this, of his life, of his goals and ideologies, and how kind of his context shaped his fight for freedom and equality.
Well, I think you have offered that fuller portrait. I have learned a ton from the book, and I'm looking forward to going back and reading it again. And so hopefully folks will also pick up a copy of I Have Avenged America for the title alone. Also, we should note, and you can't see it right here, the jacket cover is magnificent.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It's one of the best things I've ever seen. Well, Julia, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.
I want to give a shout out to the artist. Ulrich Jean-Pierre is the artist of the painting on the cover, and I'm a huge fan of his work.
I am now too. Well, Julia, thank you very much. This has been terrific.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Revolutions in Retrospect. I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, your host for this episode. Thanks to our producers, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, Patrick Long, and Jeanette Patrick. Please share the show on social media and help other listeners find it by rating and reviewing on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Revolutions in Retrospect is a joint production between Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media.